Hello there! Week in Review is back after a 2-week vacation with a special double episode recapping my vacation in Green Bay, Wisconsin and Chicago, Illinois. So sit back for an extended double episode as I tell you all about those trips. And don't worry, there will be an intermission in the middle so you can fill up your drinks and your sodas and your snacks and your popcorns and whatever. What's up, everybody? Welcome to episode number 87 of Week in Review. My name is Sean, and on this week's show, I'm going to tell you about living my lifelong dream and my trip to going to Green Bay, Wisconsin to see the Packers play at Lambeau Field. The trip was amazing. It all started on Sunday when I got to go to Lambeau Field to watch Green Bay play Minnesota. It was a really good game. Minnesota ended up only losing by 5, but Green Bay did get out to a very fast start, and they were leading 21-0, and I was a little worried because it looked like it was going to be a blowout, but Minnesota's defense picked up and slowed Green Bay's offense down, and Green Bay had to rely on their defense to slow down Minnesota and just kind of hold on to the lead. The Vikings had a couple of costly turnovers, a couple of silly penalties, and one really weird review where it looked like Stefon Diggs had scored a touchdown, but they called it back for offensive pass interference. But even sitting in the stands, I wasn't terribly sure about what exactly was going on. Like, they scored the touchdown, put the points on the board, did all that stuff, and then they're like showing the replay that the official can see in the like Microsoft Surface tablet. They're showing that on like the Jumbotron, and no one knew what they were looking at. Like, we were kind of just like, what the heck is going on here? After the play was reviewed, Minnesota had the points taken off the board, and they ended up having to settle for a field goal, so that's 3 points instead of 7. A couple of costly turnovers later in the game, including a really nice play by Green Bay's Kevin King from the University of Washington. A nice interception in the end zone helped Green Bay hold on to the lead. I thought the seats we had were really great. We had lots of action on our end of the field. We saw 2 Packers touchdowns, a Vikings touchdown or 2, maybe I guess 3 if you count the one that was taken back. Everybody seemed to be having a good time. They were very kind and respectful to each other. They stood and sat with the flow of the game. They stood up and cheered when it was appropriate, and they sat most other times, which was really great because I've been to a Washington State Cougars game where they stood the entire time, and it was kind of miserable. I just didn't like it. It's like, I want to sit. Like, I paid for this nice seat. I'm just going to hang. Well, it's not a nice seat, but like, I paid to sit on this sweet cold bench. That's what I like to do, and just watch the game unfold. I bought a delicious thing of cheese curds for like $7 or whatever it is, and it's the first time I've ever been at a stadium where I looked at what I got, and I looked at the price, and I went, yeah, that's fair. That sounds about right. The cheese curds were really good. There were a lot of them, and even with my mom sharing with me, I still only ate half to 2/3 of them, so it was a very good amount, and it lasted me the whole game, which was cool. Turns out going to the bathroom right at the start of the game was advantageous because I went, sat in my seat, then decided I wanted to keep cheese curds, got up, got cheese curds, came back with a water, a Coke, and cheese curds, and then sat there the entire time. And it was great, and it was amazing, and I couldn't believe I was there, and thankfully there was mostly cloud cover, because otherwise I would have been a much more sunburned boy than I am right now. And then I went back for a Packers-filled Monday, which was as good as Sunday, maybe even just a smidge better. I went on a trolley tour that took us around the city of Green Bay, talked a lot about the history of the city of Green Bay, and it talked about, obviously, the history of the Packers. We get to see all sorts of cool buildings, like here's the building where Curly Lambeau had the first meeting with the journalist from the Green Bay Press-Gazette, and how they decided that they were going to make a football team. We went by Curly Lambeau's actual house. They talked about there are lots of different Catholic churches in the area, and that's like a very big thing. Like, Catholicism is very big in Green Bay. We also got to see the old City Field, which is still in use by one of the Green Bay high schools, and that had a really interesting story with it where City Field was well out of date, like 15 years before the Packers ended up moving. Like, it didn't have restrooms for a very long time. It didn't have a visiting team locker room. The visiting team would have to go to a hotel that was like 6 blocks away or whatever, and they'd have to change there and then either walk to the stadium or ride a bus. And it's just like this really weird time where the NFL had like a ton of really small market teams, and they were very quickly outgrowing a city like Green Bay, and basically it got to a point where the NFL was like, hey, we're going to take the Packers away from you unless you get a new stadium. We're going to move them down to Milwaukee. They ended up getting a new stadium. They ended up calling it New City Stadium because Curly Lambeau had a divorce with the Packers, a very messy divorce with the Packers in 1949. They moved to the new stadium in the late 50s, and then in the mid 60s it was renamed rightfully to Lambeau Field. There were two other really interesting things of note. We went by an old building that was originally the Green Bay Press Gazette building. I don't remember exactly what it was now, but they were talking about how before like radio was a big thing, and obviously before like television, they would broadcast the game through a telegraph line and just display it on this big screen. And I was kind of starting to think in the back of my head of like, well, if you cared about the Packers in the early 20s and there wasn't any radio, how does that work? Like, either you go to the game or you read about it in the paper, and there is no like in between. But for them to have a setup where they're basically just broadcasting a telegraph line is insane, but like makes sense. Like, it's one of those things where like, yeah, that's like, that sounds pretty crazy, but no, that okay, that works. And then that building was right across the street from a courthouse where a bunch of paperwork was done after a guy paid $1 to get into a Packers game, got super drunk, got injured at the stadium, and then sued the Packers. The court ruled in the injured person's favor to the tune of $5,000, and Green Bay, the Packers, were like, we can't pay this. So they had ended up being 5 people that came in and saved them from bankruptcy. And it turns out they actually survived bankruptcy like 3 separate times, and then they survived a couple of cuts by the NFL. So there's like a very weird like amount of luck that happens with this particular team, and it was really cool to learn about. It was really neat just going around on the trolley and seeing all these landmarks, and like somebody bought Curly Lambeau's house, and like no one lives there, but they just kind of maintain it, and they have like a plaque out there for it, and it's just there, and it just a random regular house in the city of Green Bay. It's really cool. It was a really cool tour that did a great job at like mixing in like kind of quirky stories here and there, like the stuff with the guy who got drunk and injured, with the history of the city of Green Bay, with the history of the Packers, and it was really interesting, and it was really cool to see that stuff on a trolley, no less. After finishing the trolley tour, I went on a tour of the stadium, and while the trolley tour focused on the more like ancient history of the Packers, like quote unquote ancient history between 1919 and the late or mid 60s, when they renamed Lambeau Field to Lambeau Field, or I guess I should say New City Stadium to Lambeau Field. The stadium tour talks more about the stadium between 2003 and the present, and it focuses a lot on how they built the stadium to be a year-round destination for Packer fans, because the CEO at the time in the early 2000s was trying to figure out how to bring more revenue into Green Bay and bring more revenue into the Packers, because when like game tickets and jerseys and all that stuff is sold, it's revenue that they have to share with the NFL, and the Packers were always down towards the bottom of the revenue rankings in the NFL. And he would see people go up to the big G's outside the stadium, outside the parking lot, do like wedding photos and like take pictures and like have themselves in front of the stadium, and then they'd just walk off because there was nothing else to do. So in 2003, they enacted a plan to build the atrium to be a thing that is a year-round destination. It has one of the most successful pro shops in the NFL. It has all kinds of boardrooms and stuff for weddings and things of that nature. And it also allows them to do the stadium tours, and it boosted their revenues from the bottom of the league all the way up to the upper half. I don't think they finished any lower than 12th since that stuff opened. And stuff like the stadium tour that I went on, they don't have to share that revenue with anyone else, so it stays right with them, and it's just a really cool thing to do. The cool thing was we had a really small group of people. There were only 5 people on the tour, and then the 2 tour guides, which was really nice because it was easy to see everything, and he didn't have to use his little like speaker thing to talk, so it was easy to hear everything. And we got to go up to an alumni suite and see the stadium view from there. The alumni suites had a really cool view of the field. After we left the alumni boxes, we took an elevator down. I got to walk through the players tunnel, which was really awesome. And then we walked around the outer edge of one of the end zones, and they talked a little bit more about the stadium, and it was really neat to see the field from all kinds of different angles. If you include the angle that I saw it from the previous day, because we were on the opposite end of the field during the tour, it was really neat. I really enjoyed the stadium tour, and I thought it was fun to see the field from different angles, like all the way up in the alumni box looked really cool. Down on the field, obviously, it was awesome. Didn't get to like touch the field or anything. They were like very clear of, don't go on the field and don't do a Lambeau leap. I was like, okay, fine. But what was really nice about it was that there wasn't a ton of repeat information. There were some like basic facts that of course they're going to cover because it's the history of the Packers. But like, it feels like they looked at the trolley tour and they went, okay, we want to cover X year to Y year. And then with a stadium tour, we want to look at it from a totally different angle. And it makes it so that when you kind of like bundle them like I did, and you do one and then you do the other in the same day, it's not like, man, I just heard this information 20 minutes ago. This is kind of redundant. It's a very fun and interesting tour, and I obviously very thoroughly enjoyed myself. And that wasn't even the end of it. After the stadium tour, I finished off the rest of my day, the remaining like 3 hours I had, going over to the Packers Hall of Fame and poring over all of the information they had there. Like I said, I spent 3 hours there. I could have spent a couple more hours in there just looking at all the stuff they had. It's super detailed. It's really well labeled. It's all very interesting. They have just all the information like you could ever want from all the different eras of Green Bay's history, minus the 70s and 80s, because I don't really like to talk about them. They have lots of cool exhibits in there. They have a room that's dedicated to Packers like Hall of Fame enshrinees that has like their greatest players on little footballs, which is really awesome. In another room, they have a like almost like locker sized area to some of their greatest players that have like game worn stuff, or in the case of Reggie White, 2 candy bars, and then like a TV guide that had Brett Favre on it. And it was really, really neat. You also got to see all 13 championships they had. They have the old George Halas trophies from before the Super Bowl. They have obviously the 4 Lombardi trophies. They have a couple of conference championships in there. And then they have their most prized possession, which originally in the 1930s, there was a passed around George Halas trophy that would go to the victor for the year. And the NFL would typically give teams enough money to buy like a small replica to keep with them for all time. Well, it turns out that the main trophy got passed around a bunch, and it didn't ever get taken care of. The NFL never really like held any sort of ceremony for it. It was kind of just like given, tossed around, whatever. For a long time, it was presumed that it was just lost and gone forever, and it was just, that's too bad, so sad. But it turns out that someone found it in a Packers storage facility in 3 separate pieces, so they put it back together, and it's now one of their most prized possessions, and you can see it in the Packers Hall of Fame. Upstairs, they have, that's right, 2 floors of all the Packers stuff that you could ever ask for. They have a really cool thing on the escalator going up to the 2nd floor where you can see the change in the uniforms. It's like a big U, and you can see the original like 1919 uniforms, which are blue and gold because Curly Lambeau went to Notre Dame, and even though he didn't finish his season out there, he really enjoyed his time at Notre Dame, and he took that with him and made the uniforms blue and gold because of that. In 1935, for some reason, I didn't get a ton of clarity on exactly why they changed it, but they changed the uniforms to be green and gold, which is their current color scheme. But Curly Lambeau didn't like that, so like partway through the season, he just switched back to the blue and gold, and then there's a couple more of those, and then in 1950 is when they switched permanently to the green and gold, conveniently after Curly Lambeau left in 1949, which is only referenced in one piece of information in the building. On the upstairs level, it's a lot about the Super Bowls that they won. They have a ton of stuff from Super Bowl 45, which they won with Aaron Rodgers. They have stuff from their Super Bowl victory over the New England Patriots, and they even have a bunch of stuff from the Super Bowl that they lost to the Denver Broncos. They have more stuff for the Super Bowl that they lost than they do for an entire 2.5 decades of Packers football between 1968-ish and 1992. Kind of that weird era that Green Bay really doesn't like talking about. And that was the one thing that was weird about all of the tours and the Hall of Fame experience was no one really ever elaborated on the Curly Lambeau divorce, which honestly was news to me, and I own a complete like history of the Green Bay Packers, and it seems like they really like to focus on the big 4, and if you include Aaron Rodgers, that would make it the big 5, but it's Curly Lambeau before we left, Lombardi and Starr, and then Favre, and then I guess you could put Reggie White in there as well. You probably should put Reggie White in there as well. Where they really like talking about, hey, things were really awesome with Curly Lambeau. There were a ton of titles that were won. Then Vince Lombardi showed up with Bart Starr. They won a couple of Super Bowls. They won a bunch of NFL titles on top of that. Bart Starr coached the team, and then we're going to just skip the 80s. Bam! Hey, Brett Favre's here, and he's going to save it with Reggie White, who's the Minister of Defense and probably the greatest defensive end to ever play the game. We're back on the awesome train, and then Aaron Rodgers, he's awesome, and things are awesome, and it's like, oh, there's a whole chunk of stuff that you could talk about. Like, you can elaborate on why Curly Lambeau leaving was such a big deal. Was it because they didn't have infrastructure in place to deal with him departing? Did they just miss on some draft picks and they fell to the wayside, and kind of like a couple of losing seasons pile up and all of a sudden it's like what the heck are we doing sort of thing? And then you could look at that in the same respect in the 70s and 80s of like, what the heck happened there? And you can make the impacts of Bart Starr and Vince Lombardi and then Brett Favre and Reggie White, you can make those impacts be like, this is huge. Like it's as big as you would think it would be, but it's actually bigger because things were in shambles and draft picks were missed and there was just a lack of consistency from a coaching standpoint, whatever. But they really like to just kind of, hey, 20s through the 30s, great. 60s were great. 90s to now, great. And they skipped those other areas, which is a little bit disappointing. They had a little bit of memorabilia from the first 2 Super Bowls, and they had a really interesting exhibit based solely around the Ice Bowl, which is one of the most famous games of all time. There was also a replica of Vince Lombardi's desk. The Hall of Fame was magnificent. It was so much fun poring over all that information. And just looking at all that stuff, like all this just old game worn stuff and how cool it looks, and I loved it. 3 hours wasn't enough, and I should probably go back to finish off that little section that I had to hurry through before they closed. Going to Green Bay was every bit as amazing as I imagined it would be. Going to Lambeau Field was as incredible as I thought it would be, and as a bonus I got to ride a bus to it, so it's like the perfect like storm of Sean things to do. It was amazing. I hope I don't have to wait 25 years to go again. More Weekend Reviews coming right up after the break.
Weekend Reviews. 1 2 3 4 5 6 7 8 9 10 11 12 13 14 15 16 17 18 19 20 21 22 23 24 25 26 27 28 29 30 31 32 33 34 35 36 37 38 39 40 41 42 43 44 45 46 47 48 49 50 51 52 53 54 55 56 57 58 59 60 61 62 63 64 65 66 67 68 69 70 71 72 73 74 75 76 77 78 79 80 81 82 83 84 85 86 87 88 89 90 91 92 93 94 95 96 97 98 99 100 101 102 103 104 105 106 107 108 109 110 111 112 113 114 115 116 117 118 119 120 121 122 123 124 125 126 127 128 129 130 131 132 133 134 135 136 137 138 139 140 141 142 143 144 145 146 147 148 149 150 151 152 153 154 155 1
Welcome back to our special double-length episode of Week in Review. What's up, everybody? Welcome to episode number 88 of Week in Review. My name is Sean, and on this week's show, I'm going to tell you about my trip to Chicago that happened immediately after going to Green Bay. Got into Chicago on Wednesday and did just a little bit of walking around after getting our bags all settled. And I ended up having Chick-fil-A for the first time, and it was incredibly meh. Like, I don't understand why people really like it all that much. I had chicken nuggets and macaroni and cheese, which are two foods, and I'm pretty lenient on like how they taste. And both of them were like, they were fine, whatever. But it was a thing that I remarked where I don't ever have to have Chick-fil-A again. Like, you could tell me, Sean, you never get Chick-fil-A again for the rest of your life, and it would not bother me. That's like how just it was. However, if you take Dick's Whammies away, there's going to be a fight. On Thursday, we went down to the Navy Pier, and it was fine. We went up on the big wheel that they have, and it offered really incredible views of the Chicago skyline. Like, it was great. On one side, you have all the water. On the other side, you have the skyline. It looked beautiful, and that was a lot of fun. I'm not a super big fan of Ferris wheels, but it was worth it for the views. We took a peek at a bunch of different shops that had like super weird or quirky things, and ended up getting some pickle flavored cotton candy, which was as disgusting as it sounds. After checking out the shops, we walked all the way out to the end of the Navy Pier. There was a lot of construction going on, so there wasn't a super ton to look at once you got past the Great Wheel, and a lot of it seemed to be based around boat tours, and I didn't go on any of those. So after we got to the end, we just turned around, looked at a couple more shops on the way back through, and then packed it up and called it good. Friday was the big day, and the reason we went to Chicago, which was to go see a Cubs game at Wrigley Field. We took the L train up there, which was neat and got way better once I got above ground. I really liked the L train. Initially, I wasn't a super big fan of it. I was like, oh, I don't know how I feel about this. I don't really like being in this tunnel. It also is incredibly intimidating when you're walking on the platform and you see this train just screaming at you, and it's all like very loud. But once the L train got up above ground, I really started to enjoy it. Before the game started, we walked all over Wrigley Field, and it was interesting walking around Wrigley Field after going to Lambeau and listening to the people on the tour talk about how, like, wow, we made this a destination for Packers fans year round. Wrigley Field is there for baseball, and that's it. Like, that you're there for a baseball game. There isn't really all that much extra going on. They have like a bunch of concessions around in the concourse. Like, they have a couple of team shops. There you go. You go in, you watch a baseball game, and you leave. The double bonus of going to see a Cubs game at Wrigley is not only do you get to see Wrigley Stadium, which is really cool, I get to watch an NL game, which is not something that I get to do. I live in Spokane, Washington. The closest team to me is the Seattle Mariners. They play in the American League, which has the designated hitter rule. In the National League, which is where the Cubs play, they don't have the designated hitter rule. So it was interesting watching the manager at the time, Joe Maddon, make all these absurd and weird lineup changes to avoid having the pitcher hit at just any cost he could. If the pitcher, he wanted to put the pitcher as far away from hitting position as he possibly could, and he did that a number of times. Unfortunately for us, the Cubs lost by 1, and then we took the L train back, and I learned that I don't really like deep dish Chicago style pizza on this day. We went to a place that I'm blanking on. It started with a G, and I got like a meat supreme pizza. We just had meat and like extra meat and more meat, and yeah, I think I ate like half a slice of it. I was not that big of a fan of it. On Saturday, rode the bus up to the free public zoo that they have, walked around a nice little area. It's pretty compact, nothing's too terribly far away from each other, and has a good variety of animals, and I saw a frog poop, which that was about the most notable thing that happened. After the zoo, we went to Portillo's, and Portillo's wouldn't mean anything to me. I wouldn't care at all, except that I've been watching Greg Miller and Kind of Funny for their entire existence, which has been a little over 4 years, and even him back in his podcast Beyond days, where he would talk about Portillo's. And as soon as the trip was announced, where it's like, hey, we're going to Chicago, we're going to the Midwest, I made sure to make a note of like, I'm going to Portillo's, like that's going to happen. Portillo's is a hot dog place, and we first went to Portillo's in Wisconsin, and I'd never heard of like the stylistic choices that they made. Like I'd always just heard about like, wow, they have really good hot dogs. And granted, this is from one man on a podcast. They have really great hot dogs. And they have this cool shake and like this, that, and the other thing. So I didn't know what to expect from like how the interior is designed. And I wouldn't have guessed that it was like very 1930s vibed. That would have been one of my last guesses. I probably would have guessed that it was just a regular hot dog place. So color my face surprised when I walked in. I was like, man, this is like very 30s. They have like all the employees have like very stylized uniforms. They have the 1930s hats, and it was really interesting. Turns out in Wisconsin, Portillo's has a specific like a bratwurst with sauerkraut on top of it that's offered exclusively in Wisconsin. So we got that, and then we got it was a Polish, I believe, with grilled onions on top of it. And the bratwurst wasn't particularly good. I liked the brat itself. It had like a little bit of cheese in the middle, but the sauerkraut that was on top of it was like charred way too much and it just didn't taste very good. The Polish that we got was a lot better because I like grilled onion and had like, I think that one had the stone mustard on it, and that was really good. I also got a bowl of chili and I ate like half of that in bed. I think I made a tweet about it. I was like, what are you doing? I'm like, I'm laying in bed eating chili. What about you? I'm like, okay, cool. When I went to Portillo's in Chicago, I got a chili dog. We got a Chicago dog, and then got another Polish. The chili dog was absolutely fantastic. I loved it. The Chicago dog is a bit too much for me. There's a lot of stuff going on with there. There's tomato and mustard and sea celery and like all this stuff and a big pickle that like moistens the bread a lot. And we ate it and it was fine. It was like, okay, like not for me. So I don't really like Chicago deep dish pizza. I also don't really like a Chicago dog, but I did like the city and I enjoyed walking around in it. So they had that going for it. And again, the chili cheese dog was so good. So good. I don't think I've ever had a chili cheese dog where it like actually stays, the chili like stays on. Like it was like the correct level of thickness on top. God, I am making myself hungry just talking about it. It was so good. I had a lot of fun in Chicago. I enjoyed walking around the city, going to Wrigley Field. It was really cool. We got to see a bunch of the old Chicago Cubs logos. One of them looked like, and my mom said, and I quote, that one looks like the Bears taking a shower, and now I can't unsee that. I also never would have guessed that this logo that's on my hat was used in the 70s. I would have guessed it would have been in the late 30s, early 40s, somewhere in there, just due to the simplicity and the art style of it. Kind of just dinked around, did a couple random things here and there, went to the zoo, went to Navy Pier, and I watched a bunch of The Office. So it was a very good trip. Thank you so much for watching this week's double-length special episode of Week in Review. If you like the content, scroll on down and hit that subscribe button. If you like the content enough, you can scroll on down and you can leave me a comment. You can tell me if you've ever been to Green Bay, Wisconsin, or Chicago, Illinois. You can tell me your experience there, and you can tell me why I suck, because I don't like Chicago dogs or deep dish pizza, but I do love cheese curds. Be sure to head over to twitch.tv/ShawnosaurusRex for streams this weekend, Wednesday, Friday, Saturday, and Sunday. I'm aware Wednesday isn't a weekend day. And be sure to check back every Tuesday for more Week in Review, unless I'm out of town.